I'd like to welcome David Sheasby, who is the Head of Stewardship and ESG at Martin Currie, now part of a very large worldwide group of investment businesses. David has been working in the investment world for quite a long period of time, but most recently has been focused on ESG issues. And one of the reasons why we thought it would be fantastic for him to come and speak to us as the kind of HR and people community about this is because the investment world has been familiar with and using ESG concepts for much longer than most of us who work in the people space. David will tell you a bit more about his and Martin Currie's track record in ESG. But unlike probably most of us, he's been very familiar with and working with ESG terms for over a decade, probably more like a decade and a half. And what that means is that he's operating in a very mature market. So we thought that as the HR community starts to embrace ESG, and particularly the S of ESG, on a more day-to-day basis, it would be great for us to see if there are lessons we can learn from David with his track record in the investment world. So without further ado, I will hand over to David, who's going to take us through what investors, professional investors, are looking for from the HR team in terms of ESG. So welcome, David, and thanks again for being with us, but over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Tony, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I was just going to run through a little bit of background in terms of who Martin Currie is, for those less familiar. Talk a little bit about kind of how we approach ESG, and then, as Tony said, obviously the increasing focus on the S within ESG, and then the types of things that we look at and the types of frameworks we use, but then also the role that we have as share owners on behalf of our clients, and kind of how we think about that. If we just go on to the next slide. So really, I mean, for those of you kind of less familiar with Martin Currie, so we are an active equity manager. So we manage portfolios for pension funds and wealth managers, endowments, etc. We have about 26 billion of assets under management. We have a long history as a firm, but we're now part of the Franklin Templeton Group. So Franklin Templeton has about $1.5 trillion of assets under management, and we've been involved in stewardship and ESG for a long time. So we've basically been focused on that for over a decade, and it's really embedded across our investment team. So we have 48 investors across the business, located in different parts of the world. So my role at Martin Currie is as head of stewardship and ESG. I was a portfolio manager for 30 years, and then in 2015 took on the role as head of stewardship and ESG. It's not my role to do it. It's really my role to kind of oversee and work with all the investors on what we're doing. I manage, for example, relationships with bodies like the Principles of Responsible Investment, the Investment Association, which is our major kind of trade body. And then I'm also the co-chair of the Franklin Templeton Stewardship and Sustainability Council, which is a working group across the Franklin Templeton group. So we just go on to the next slide. When we think about ESG, I guess if we stand back just for a moment, ESG means different things to different people. So there are lots of different approaches to ESG. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And there are lots of different approaches taken by asset managers such as ourselves. Some take a kind of thematic approach, some take an impact approach, some take an ethical or a best in class or negative screening. But we very much approach it as an integration. So it's part of how we invest, it's part of how we think about companies, it's part of how we think about the particular what is material to the different businesses. So it's really, as I say, it's part of how we invest. So there are kind of 4 key elements to what we do. When we look at companies, we're looking to identify kind of what is material to the business. We look to integrate that into how we think about those businesses. Then it's also about how we act as ongoing owners on behalf of our clients. So how do we act as stewards of their capital, and how do we interact with the companies that we're investing in and effectively engage and, for example, vote the proxies on this. And then also, clearly, it's about partnership with our clients as well. So we're there to effectively deliver on the outcomes that our clients want and need. So the key question for us that we ask is, what is it that might impact the ability of a company to generate long-term sustainable returns? So that's really the kind of key question that we're asking when we're looking at what might be material, and then how do we integrate that into the investment case that we build. Partnership with clients is really important, but also through the memberships and the organizations that we are part of, that's also really important in terms of how we see our role as an asset manager. Lots of these, so we're partners, members, contributors to all of these bodies at the bottom here. There's a big emphasis in those on climate, which is perhaps not a surprise. Climate is a big focus for our clients and for many clients, and so that's been a key area that we've been focused on in terms of delivering what they want. But what we've seen over the course of the last couple of years is that we're seeing more of a focus now on the S, so the social aspect of ESG, and I'll come on to that in just a moment. If you just go on to the next slide, I mentioned, so one of the things that the way we've chosen to think about ESG is just part of investment, so it's very much integrated into our overall approach, and the responsibility for that analysis, that's the integration, and also what we call the active ownership, so that engagement, etc. That really sits with the portfolio managers. So my role is there to work with the portfolio managers and analysts, and kind of set frameworks in terms of how we think about things, but also keeping an eye on what's coming down the pipe. So what are the emerging topics that we need to be ready for and think about in terms of the toolkits and the analysis that we need to be doing effectively to meet these requirements. So if we look at, as I said, there's been a big focus on the environmental, so particularly climate. And if we go on to the next slide, what we've seen over the course of the last couple of years is an increasing focus on social. So and this is clearly relevant, particularly relevant in the HR space, and I think this has really been brought to the fore partly by things like COVID, so COVID-19 pandemic, things like the Black Lives Matter protests, the Me Too movement. All of these have been very kind of powerful drivers, I think, in terms of the increased recognition for social change and the important contributions that businesses can make to this. So that that's been really important. The other thing that we've observed is a wave of regulatory change, and that's supporting this kind of increased focus on social. And one thing that I would particularly note is the establishment of a social taxonomy in Europe, which is part of the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. And apologies, that's another acronym, but that's the SFDR. And the main purpose of the regulation in Europe is really to reorient capital flows towards more sustainable businesses and kind of increase the transparency on sustainability. So it's really about flows and transparency. And there's a lot of reporting detail that's going to come associated with that. And the social taxonomy is there effectively to identify kind of activities that are contributing to some of the social objectives that Europe has set out. So I think it's fair to say that social issues are kind of clearly pressing for companies and stakeholders generally. But one of the challenges is how to capture that, and what kind of metrics and how to really define and quantify the S in ESG. So it's on the E, there's been a huge focus, and obviously there's a big focus in particularly on things like greenhouse gas emissions. On things like G, obviously, again, there's been quite a lot of transparency around corporate governance over the course of the last decade or so. And it's really that on the S side, I think it's a lack of consistency and comparability that makes this really quite challenging. And I think the other thing is also in many cases there isn't an established track record. So actually, looking at I've said here to kind of trends and relative positioning can provide insight, but actually sometimes that's quite difficult to get hold of and actually understand in any great detail. So what we're really interested in is how companies think about these things, and broadly, if we stand back, when we think about environmental, social, and governance, that really comes under the umbrella of sustainability. So that it's broadly described as sustainability, and as I said, what we're looking for is to understand what might impact the ability of a company to generate long-term sustainable returns. And what we're interested in particularly is how ESG or sustainability informs a company's strategy. So how does it impact the decisions that the companies make? And one of the things that we're interested in looking at is also how a company talks about sustainability and how it talks about particular issues, so how it identifies what is material to the business, etc. And who talks about that. So what we see sometimes is we see a very nice polished corporate sustainability report, but sustainability is never mentioned in the chairman's statement or in the more broadly in the annual report, and that tells us something about where sustainability sits in terms of how a company thinks about things. So the communication around sustainability is really important, and where and how that is communicated is important. So if you just go on to the next slide, just in terms of when we think about the kind of S aspect, there are different things that we can look at. So governance is actually one of those, because what we're interested in there is things like the board profile, so what that looks like, how that's changed, what the process is around how to address potential shortcomings in board structure. One of the very visible measures is diversity. And that's clearly something that is a big focus, and actually is now in regulation for example, in the UK, there are kind of guidelines around what expectations are in terms of board diversity representation, both from a gender and also from a minority point of view. Something like corporate culture is very important as well, but corporate culture is very difficult to get your hands around, and really a lot of that is around questions that we ask companies around how they think about culture, how they define it, how they measure it, examples of how culture is driven through their organizations, whether it's to the extent to which it's something that's really discussed at the board, is it what actions are taken when you actually want to shift culture, which is, as you know, is a very difficult task. Also, things like ethics as well. So bribery and corruption, the ability to things like whistleblowing, how the extent to which, for example, contractors are held to the same standards as employees within a business. As I mentioned, diversity and inclusion is a big focus, and that's both within the board, but also particularly within the kind of broader workplace, and then also how any kind of shortcomings in that are being addressed. And I'm speaking from the point of view as an asset manager, and the asset management industry is not a shining example of diversity in terms of that. So, there's a lot of work that we're doing at the moment to try and address that, for example. And human rights is something which is becoming a big focus, and that's particularly across own operations, but also the supply chain for companies. And that is becoming part of regulation within Europe, but also we're seeing, for example, big collaborative engagements around this on organised through organisations such as the PRI, so the Principles of Responsible Investment. So they've just launched a human rights collaborative engagement, which is really looking to kind of identify and address potential challenges there. And I guess also, the human capital, which is, I think, always a slightly harsh description, but it's basically the people in the business. They are what we tend to see is that companies will very often say, our people are our most important asset, and then don't necessarily talk enough about kind of what they're doing to support that, and thinking about how they're future-proofing the workforce through, for example, training, development, etc. And so that transparency is really helpful for us in terms of understanding how that important asset within their business is supported. So, and issues like data security and cybersecurity are very important, and clearly the pandemic has had a big issue. If you just go on to the next slide, so one of the things is to think about some of the frameworks that can be helpful in terms of how to kind of analyze some of the potential issues, or thinking about where we might identify potential challenges or controversies that we want to explore or engage with companies on. So one of the overarching frameworks that we use and is used is increasingly used, and for example, it frames a lot of the European regulation, is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So those are 17 goals with the target of addressing these by 2030, and underlying that are 109 specific targets, and it's really the targets that companies can look to address, and because they are either relevant to governments or companies, and so we're very interested in where companies can effectively support those. Things like the UN Global Compact, which is a kind of voluntary framework, and there are, I think, five of them are related to human rights, labour, or bribery and corruption. And again, that's a useful framework to identify potential controversies and areas that we want to, as investors, to go and explore and understand kind of what the redress mechanisms are around those, etc. And then a framework like the International Labour Organization, that the general principles there, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, those are kind of a very, very broad set of guidelines, which as an asset manager, again, we're now in Europe, actually, we're asked to use that as a kind of a framework in terms of how we look at companies. And then things like the Workforce Disclosure Initiative, which is run by, effectively that's run by Share Action, which is a responsible investment NGO, and that's really looking to build on disclosures around the workforce. So they write out to 1,000 companies. Well, they wrote out to 1,000 companies last year, looking to encourage companies to use their framework effectively in the survey to make the disclosures, which are kind of more detailed but also standardized to kind of effectively help on this. And then the regulatory framework, so things like the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, that's a kind of really important development that we've seen in Europe. And that's, again, that's kind of pushing the social agenda and looking to encourage disclosure, as the name describes. So it really is about kind of disclosures. So just go on to the last slide. So obviously, one of the things I mentioned was that part of our role is also how we think about our role as share owners on behalf of our clients. And then it's really about where we identify something which is potentially not where it could be or should be, then how do we work with the companies that we're invested in to try and nudge and drive change? So this is really about engagement. So working with, it might be the board, it might be HR, it might be the investor relations, depending on what the issue is. And it's really about where an issue is potentially material to that business over the long term. How do we think about engaging with the company to try and drive change? And this is really a summary of kind of the type of activity that we have done as a business over the course of 2021. Most of what we do is one-on-one with companies, but on the right-hand side, these are some examples of some of the engagements that we've done in conjunction with other investors, so collaborative engagements. One of them we did on employee relations, so that was back in probably 2015, 2016, and that was really focused on the retail sector in particular, and looking at employee relations there, and also the frameworks that companies used, and also the disclosures that we were making. And so we actually, at that point, we were working particularly with one of the Russian companies to increase their disclosure and help them kind of frame what they were doing on employee relations. But generally, these are the topics on the right-hand side are more systemic topics where it's more powerful to actually get together with other investors to engage with companies. But that's a kind of key part of how we see our role as investors on behalf of our clients. So that's kind of why I was going to stop there. There are some additional slides here which really just run through some of a little bit more detail on some of the stuff that we do at Martin Currie, some of the frameworks we use, and some of the initiatives that we support. But really kind of open it up to questions.
Great. Thanks very much, David. The main thing I took from that, although I do have an optimism bias, is that HR is going to become more and more important, which is good news, I think, for everybody on this call. I did want to, so a couple of questions come in. You mentioned that retail was one of the areas where you'd had active engagement. But are there any sectors that you think human capital issues coming under the S of ESG are more relevant or a particular focus compared to others?
So I think when we look at a company, we look to understand kind of who are the key stakeholders and what are what aspects of the business are likely to be most material. So one example is in the software or IT sector, intellectual capital is really important, and actually the ability to kind of attract and retain that intellectual capital is incredibly important. we've done quite a lot of work with companies there where we've identified potential changes in, for example, you start to see changes in turnover statistics for the companies. That can be it's not always, but that can be a warning sign. We want to understand why that's happening, and effectively how a company is looking to address that where it's a potential issue.
Oh, great. Then another question just on metrics. You had on your slide, I think it's 5 or 6 different sources of kind of what you described as frameworks. But if people on the call are thinking, right, I'd like to start thinking about pulling some metrics together for my company that might help, is there one of those that they should look to first, or is there an initial source that would be a good starting point?
I would probably point to 2 actually, and I'm cheating here because one of them is on the slide, one of them's not. So I think the Workforce Disclosure Initiative is useful to look at in terms of the types of questions that are asked, because that's really quite a detailed framework and survey, and the aim of that is to provide standardized metrics across the across different businesses. So definitely worth something worth looking at. And the other one I would say, and the reason it's not on the slide at the moment is because it's not actually fully happened yet. But the standardization of data around ESG is a big topic and a big challenge for investors and also companies. And at the COP26, the International Sustainability Standards Board was established, and that's really about the disclosures and the disclosures that companies will be required to make over time, and it's really putting them on the same footing as financial disclosures. And the ISSB has put out a kind of draft sustainability standard. So they've just issued that in the last probably 6 weeks. And that's a kind of first step in terms of what they will be looking for from companies. So I'm happy to share that with you, Tony. You could share that on. But that will give you some pointers, I think, in terms of the types of things that are going to be asked for.
Well, that's brilliant. That's us at 12:59. So propose to give you 30 seconds of your lunch break back. But before you go, just a quick plug for any Workbox subscribers who are listening. We have now got an ESG page on Workbox, which talks about HR's role in ESG. In addition to everything that David's given us. And in addition, today, Brodie's launched our environmental, social and governance website page. So if you want any help on ESG issues more broadly from us, then that website page gives you some details. Final thing, just a quick advance warning that we are looking to schedule our next session in the series. That's going to be on mental health in the workplace. And we're going to be joined by Sam H. So that should be a good session for anyone who's involved with absence and mental health. And then finally, just to say thank you so much to David. I think it's a real privilege for those of us who work in the people space to hear directly from professional investment people like David, because it just gives us a glimpse into what we know is going to come, because what happens at that level inevitably trickles down into the broader world of UK corporate life. So hopefully you found that as helpful as I did. And if we were all in the same room, I would invite you to show your appreciation for David in the usual way, but we can't do that. So if you could show some appreciation to David by perhaps filling out the survey, which I understand is going to be forced upon you by our technical people. And if you manage to dodge that, we will try and send it to you again with the slides and the Zoom follow-up. But with that, thank you very much for attending. Thank you again to David, and I look forward to seeing you at our next session.
Thanks very much for the opportunity.